Hello, I'm Kat Allman with Google's Open Source Programs Office, and it is my extreme pleasure today to introduce Kim Stanley Robinson. He is both a Hugo and a Nebula Award-winning science fiction author who presents us with a rather challenging view of the near future in his latest trilogy about climate change. He's here today to talk to us about climate change in Google, and I would ask you all to welcome Kim Stanley Robinson.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I am indeed going to talk about Google and climate change, and it's a good time to be talking about it because it's a busy week in the world of climate change. We have the conference going on down in Bali right now to try to set up the successor to the Kyoto Treaty. We have the Nobel Prize a little while ago, and really an ongoing flood of scientific reports on the situation. Everything from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the atmosphere is being gauged to try to figure out what's going on and what we can predict or not predict. It's also true that with this Senate energy bill, the energy bill out of Congress is passed in the House, but it's stalled in the Senate. There's only 53 votes, so that a 60-vote override of a veto cannot happen, and the objections at this point are to a 15% renewable energy requirement by the year 2020 and a $21 billion tax on the oil industry, both of which are not acceptable to the people opposed to the bill. So it is stalled at this moment, and on the floor of the House of Representatives, a representative from Georgia brought a chunk of coal into the House and put it on the table and said, what's going to become of this if we pass this bill? So this is the world that we live in right now. So the other thing I'd like to add about this week is that Senator John Warner had voted against a weaker version of this bill just a couple of years ago, and yet he is a co-sponsor of the bill this year, and people asked him what had changed his mind, and this was his answer. And I want us to remember this thought because it's an important phrase. John Warner has managed to encapsulate the reason why we might be interested in climate change right now and what we're going to end up doing about it. Now, you get so many messages out of the media, and I wanted to highlight what I call the disconnect and the gross discrepancy between certain messages. The IPCC and many other scientists are calling for like an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by the year 2050. Some call for 90%. We have a chance of reaching 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That would probably raise the average temperatures by about 2 degrees Celsius. If we get up to 560 parts per million, then we've probably had a 3 degrees Celsius rise in average temperatures, and at that point the planet is cooked, so to speak, irreversible change and tremendous damage. And so at the same time, new oil fields like the gigantic one discovered off the coast of Brazil have been discovered to great joy and fanfare, and one coal plant a week is being built in China, and elsewhere in the world coal plants are still being built that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And many people are beginning to call for climate adaptation rather than climate mitigation, with the idea that this is a train that we cannot stop that we're on. And so there are this gigantic divergence in our attitudes towards the situation coming out of essentially the same culture and the same body of information. And this has always fascinated me as a novelist. How can we be looking at the same picture and as human beings come up with such radically divergent interpretations of what's going on to the point of being in grotesque conflict with each other? And the answer really, I think, and this is something that we're going to be discussing for the entire rest of the talk, is ideology. And I wanted to share with you Althusser's definition because I think it's a particularly useful one, because what it does is it takes ideology out of the realm of a pejorative, where you would say, well, you're being ideological, but I'm being correct. And this is a very common usage of the word, but what I want to emphasize here is that we all have an ideology. And not only that, but it's necessary. Because reality is too big, and too overwhelming for us to be able to comprehend it without various kinds of filters and interpretive devices in our minds, concepts, etc. And these all together function as an imaginative relationship. So there's two things. There is a real situation out there. It's real. It's real and the same for everybody. But of course, our imaginary relationship with this real situation is partial, and it's tempered by our thoughts and our concepts. And so you can't get by without an ideology. If you were without one, it would be a kind of a form of maybe mental retardation or a disability, in that you would be overwhelmed. And maybe you could say that autistic people don't have an ideology or something like that. But let's admit that everybody has one. And for someone like me who has lived all my life with spectacles on, it's an easy metaphor to think of an ideology as a kind of a set of spectacles, that what you would want out of an ideology is perhaps the biggest view screen, the most clarity, the fewest number of blind spots, the fewest number of blinders, the idea that maybe you could see the whole picture rather than the top half of the picture, and that you would want to maybe grind your lenses in a continual process to try to clarify your vision and see more, understand more, so that, as mathematicians would say, you would have more power and elegance to your ultimate vision, and things would make more sense in a way that doesn't involve grotesque contradictions, etc. And that would be what you would want out of your ideology, but that we all have them. So from that point of view, and if you think of, maybe I could say very briefly that my own ideology would be very similar to perhaps what John Warner said: science and my grandchildren. I'm a science fiction writer. I'm always trying to look at our moment from the point of view of the future, a few generations down the line, to see what it illuminates. And then science, it strikes me, is the most powerful intellectual methodology that we have. So by coincidence, I believe, Senator John Warner came very close to describing what I would like to call my own ideology. So, and from that point of view, from the point of view of science and our grandchildren, the situation is getting really, really severe, because when we say climate change, we don't just mean climate change. We are using it as metonymy, or it may be that it's synecdoche. I have to admit that even though I've been a rhetoric instructor my entire life, I've never fully comprehended the distinction between metonymy and synecdoche. But in any case, the part for the whole. When we say the White House, and we mean the whole administration. When they say the land belongs to the crown, they don't mean that the crown owns the land. And so that's what metonymy is. And when we say climate change, we're using it conveniently, and sometimes in a way that distorts the full situation, in order to mean really the full environmental degradation that's going on right now. And I don't want to waste any time in this talk rehearsing things that we all already know already, so I'm not really going to take too much time here. But I would want to point out the ocean acidification. The CO2 that we're putting up in the atmosphere, a certain percentage of it gets uptaked by the ocean, and it acidifies the ocean. And the pH of the ocean has changed from its first measured levels till now, and has become more acidic by a degree that is measurable, and is leading to the notion that it could be dangerous for those smallest sea creatures who make their shells out of calcium carbonates, and who may not be able to survive a shift toward a more acid ocean base. And these little creatures form part of the bottom level of the food pyramid inside the ocean. And we all know from our third grade science classes that when the bottom of a food pyramid collapses, everything above it is in big trouble. And of course, we are at the top of that food chain along with many other creatures. So that when people talk about climate change and they say, well, it really has to do with the air, the temperature, the weather, we can probably farm better if it gets warmer, we can turn on the air conditioner, we can survive the occasional extreme weather events, we just have to up our insurance policies, et cetera, et cetera. What they're avoiding talking about, even though they usually know it at that moment, is everything else that's going along with climate change, partly causal, partly result, partly independently being caused by the effects of human impact on the environment. And so it's not just the climate. And when someone like Bjorn Lomborg, who was here at Google in August, says, well, quit focusing on climate so much, really we have very much worse problems than climate, to me this is not a reassuring notion. It doesn't mean that you can then forget about climate. What it means is that climate is just one symptom of a much larger problem that we have to deal with altogether. So the result is that the scientific community has been going off like an alarm in a hotel. It's unique in history. It's never happened before that scientists have spoken as a community and as scientists about a emergency situation for society at large. By and large, the scientific community has been happy to stay in their labs and in the field and doing their work. That's what they want to do. That's what they like. And even during the nuclear standoff of the Cold War, most of the scientific community gave it over to the nuclear scientists to go ahead and sound the alarm about the dangers of a nuclear holocaust, figuring that otherwise it was obvious and they didn't need to disturb themselves and they could keep on with their work. In the last 5 years, that just hasn't been true. There has been an outcry like never before. There are about 10 scientific articles and media articles per day in the major media online that can be collated and put out there, and 10 a day quickly begins to add up because each one of them seems very significant and is saying something new and major. And with all of the impacts that I described to you in the previous slide that add on with climate change, the question is becoming in the scientific community, is it already too late? Can we do anything about this situation? Or are we merely imagining that we can do something about climate change when it's too late? Wally Brooker, a climate scientist from Washington, published an interesting essay in Science magazine suggesting that we only can burn about 720 gigatons of carbon between now and the 560 parts per million limit that will put us into irreversible damage. He suggested that there should be a carbon pie and that it should be basically population-based, that each person on the planet had the right to about 1/6 billionth of the burn of that 720 gigatons. And so that meant that the developed world, the major industrial countries, the major emitters, really only deserved about 20% of the remaining carbon burn that we have left to us in this century. And that puts us down to about 150 gigatons, and we are burning it at a rate of about 8 per year. So essentially, the industrial world has about 25 years left, and then they've used up their allotted share. Now, this ignores the political realities that, in fact, the developed world owns most of that carbon and has no intention of dividing it up on an equal population basis with the rest of the world. But it's a measure of the scientists' kind of desperation to search for new ways to talk about the emergency. James Hansen of NASA has become quite famous talking about this, and he recently compared the coal trains to the trains of the Holocaust leading to the death camps. A rather shocking statement that got him quite a bit of controversy as a result. But what you see is that the scientists are getting really, really alarmed because we don't seem to be responding as fast as we need to. This is the most recent, very wonderful USGS NASA combined internet photo of Antarctica. And I put it in there because the part of Antarctica that is not sea ice in the middle, that is pure white, is about the size of the United States and Mexico combined. And it's nicely divided across the middle by the Transantarctic Mountains, so that the eastern Antarctic ice sheet is the lower one that is closer to us. The western Antarctic ice sheet is the smaller one that is more, say, the shape of Mexico, but pointing up towards South America there. And the Transantarctics are the uneven line dividing the two. Well, the western Antarctic ice sheet is the one that is resting on ground, but the ground is below sea level. So it's a weight of about 6,000 to 8,000 feet cake of ice that is so heavy that it's on ground, but that ground is below sea level. That's an unstable configuration. The West Antarctic ice sheet can come off with only a little bit more warming, and it has come off frequently in the Earth's past. Because once it gets warmer and it starts to break up at the edges, the tides rip at it and it slides off into the sea. And at that point, you've got an 8,000-foot tall cake of ice dropping into the sea, and 90% of it goes underwater like icebergs do. And that's why if the Western Antarctic ice sheet were to come off, you would have a rise of sea level worldwide that would be about 7 meters. In other words, about 23 feet. And we'd be in water right in this room, I believe. But it's certainly about a quarter of the world's population would be affected. And you call that maybe 2 billion people by the time it happens, and you get something like 1,000 Katrinas in terms of the number of people displaced. And we can't handle 1,000 Katrinas. We couldn't even handle the one. And it's an indication of the severity of the problem. And it's only really, it's the most spectacular of the disasters that could happen, but there are others like the stopping of the monsoon or the melting of the Himalayan glaciers and a destruction of the water source for most of the Asian populations around the Himalayas that would be equally devastating to humanity and are just as likely and probably more likely than or quicker than the coming off of the Western Antarctic ice sheet. So there's in an attempt to grasp at even an analysis of is there a solution at this point, scientists have gone into a number of different studies, and one of the most famous of them is by Sokolow and Pakala. This was in Scientific American just last year in 2006, the wedge concept. That you take the circle diagram, I think, is best for this point, and sorry for my reproductions. I only really mean to show you the wedges themselves and the way that they've been portrayed differently in different kinds of articles. And the reason that I wanted to do that will become clear shortly. But in any case, each one of these wedges, if it was pursued fully, would lead over the next 3 or 4 decades to a savings in carbon burn. So that the bottom left there shows you the carbon burn if we did nothing, and then each wedge, if effectively pursued, would cut it back down to the blue thing at the bottom would be if we had pursued all of them successfully over time. And this made me think that these ways of graphically representing the problem are a little bit inadequate. It's not intuitive when you look at any of these how they were going to work. And I want to remind you of the great graph by Menard. This is Napoleon's invasion of Moscow in 1812. This is, as it says, probably the best statistical graphic ever drawn. And what it made me wonder is, could we have Google Graphics? One of the things that Google is, among many other things, is information technology and the processing of information technology to clarify the issue. And the conceptual understanding depends on visual representation. The human beings are very much better in understanding a situation if they see it and can imagine it visually in their minds, spatially. So it seems to me that one thing that Google could be doing is having a really top-notch graphics department that begins to try to represent the problem of climate change better than it has ever been before. It also occurred to me that that wouldn't be a bad model right there for what we hope for carbon. You know, in the next century, it should be like Napoleon's March and start out with 450,000 people and end up with about 10,000 people at the end of the winter. That this is the 21st century carbon story if we can make it happen. So this leads to my notion that there really ought to be a kind of Google climate, that you have information sorted, because we have the famous drinking from the fire hose problem once again. There's so much news. It comes in every day at a rate of 10 articles a day. There's a atmospheric scientist at University of Illinois named Michael Schlesinger who's doing a wonderful service in collecting all of the internet articles about climate that he can find and then sending them along to a list that he has compiled of I don't know how many people. But it strikes me that that is a very labor-intensive and incredibly useful service that he's providing for free and on his own recognizance to try to do what he can to help. But Google has a lot more resources and might be able to do this not only more completely, but also do it for its entire client base in a way. So, and then also prioritizing. This is a famous problem, but it seems to me that, and it takes human judgment to do it, but it seems to me that maybe one thing Google could be involved with is providing a little bit of prioritization so that it's the most important climate news that comes through to your clientele and not just everything, so that you provide a little stopper on the fire hose and get it back down to drinking fountain size. The other things, it would be neat if when you went to the Google homepage that you could find out how much electricity your house was burning that very moment. It would be neat if you could calculate your personal carbon burn and use also ecological footprint measurements. We're now using, ecological footprint measurements on the global scale. We're now using like 1.3 Earths. We passed the carrying capacity limit of the planet back around 1990, as far as people can tell. But this is a very difficult thing to judge, and so it would be interesting to go into. And I put mission architectures in there because this is the word that I used before the invention of this wedge diagram. The idea that what would be interesting would be to describe everything that we could do and analyze it on a cost-benefit way that actually includes real costs, real benefits, political problems, the advantages and disadvantages of each one of the methods, and then also put them on a timeline of, okay, we need to do this then, and then that will lead to the other thing. And slowly but surely, the developments necessary to get our carbon burn down in a timely fashion would be described in full. This is a project that is an information technology project, and Google is as well equipped to do it as anybody and is more publicly placed to disperse that information afterwards, which is one of the problems if you are, say, at a small university and you manage to do this beautiful thing. The dispersal of that knowledge is not quite as certain for somebody in a small science department in a small university than it is for you guys. So something to be thought of. Oh boy, let's do the next. Okay, just very quickly, even if you had a good mission architecture, and really I think that's one of the easier parts of the problem, because none of these things require new technologies, although many of them can be improved. But mostly the problems come in the following areas, really. The scale is huge. When you, compare this to the ozone hole layer problem. The ozone layer had a hole in it. It was a matter of chlorofluorocarbons, hexafluorocarbons being inserted into the atmosphere. We gathered together, international treaty was passed to say, let's not do that anymore. And pretty much those chemicals stopped entering the atmosphere, although it's been a little bit compromised lately. But those were refrigerator coolants and air conditioning fluid. And so the quantities were small. In this case, we're talking about the carbon burn, and really it comes down to everything. Our energy, our creation of our energy systems, and our transport are the two biggest factors. But we are burning carbon in a way that really makes refrigerator coolant look like nothing whatsoever. So the scale is huge. Inertia, path dependency, they sometimes call it. Any technology you set into place is going to continue to be used and to continue to emit whatever it emits for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so we are path dependent, especially in the sense of infrastructure and technology. But there's also path dependency in law and in culture. And these are often pretended to be as massively entrenched as the infrastructure, although we see rapid cultural change from time to time, so that we know that it isn't quite true, and it's possibly a political stance to say that, oh, you could never change the law, or oh, you could never change the way people are, which means our culture only. So I mentioned quickly, you know, this bad feedback. It's one of these weird ironies that if we were to have clean coal for our coal plants, we would not be putting up the sulfur in the atmosphere that appears to be the reason why we have solar dimming. We're only getting 90% of the sunlight that we got when we started to measure it, and it's a little mysterious why. I mean, that's a big difference. But apparently it's because a lot of the light is bouncing out because of the sulfur that we've put up there. So we get clean coal, we're going to get 10% more sunlight. And so in climate terms, this is a problem. And then lastly, active human opposition. There are going to be people who are going to be fighting tooth and nail to keep any of these reforms from happening. That's just the way it is. We see it happening in the Senate floor this very week. We see it happening in Bali, and it's never going to go away. So this is really too bad, but it's inevitable. And I think all you can say at this point is that it's an ideological problem. We need to try to convince as many people as we can that this is real and important. And also take comfort in the fact that many times in the democracies, you only need to convince 50% of the people, or maybe 60% if you need to override a veto, but that you don't have to convince 100% of the people. And that's good, because, yeah?
Second time you said it, it takes 2/3 override, it takes 69% to block a
Oh, okay. So you can block with 60, but it takes 67 to override a veto. Sorry, yeah, I knew that, but I've been misspeaking myself.
You have to
Well, for this purpose, let's just say you need 51%. Let's hope that, by and large, the problem is severe enough that the minority that is constantly going to remain opposed to this effort are either going to be convinced or rendered politically inoperative so that we can get this done in a timely fashion. People ask me, as a novelist, explain these people, and I want to just remind you of a joke word invented by Karl Popper, monocausotaxophilia, the love of single causes that explain everything. And this is a love that we all kind of have. It would be so nice, it would be convenient if we could explain everything with a single cause. And you see physicists still grasping after the grand unified theory. You see fundamentalists of all kinds taking a great deal of comfort in the idea that there's this one explanation that explains everything. You see economic fundamentalists like free market fundamentalists who really grasp for the single explanation, the single mechanism that would make everything possible. But when you talk to biologists, or when you look at the diagram of the genome and realize that's really only part of the story, even when you talk to physicists and they say, oh, well, we do have the single explanation, it's really simple, it's quantum mechanics. And then you think, okay, well, if that's the simple solution, I don't want to see the hard solution. And so we've got to get past, I think, this notion that there will ever be a single cause that explains everything. And we also are going to have to get past an economic system that relies on it as being the ultimate way to deal with these affairs. Because we live within an economic system that is truly inadequate to the problem that we have right now. The economic system does a couple of things that are wrong, big flaws. First, physical reality isn't properly accounted for. Many real costs are externalized and not counted in the price of things. And this has caused one of the basic discrepancies that is never accounted for in standard capitalist economics. And the other problem with it is that it retains the hierarchical power structure of its predecessor historically, of feudalism, that essentially it's a nice thing to remember this conceptual rubric of residual and emergent, with the idea that at any given moment in our history, there is a lot that is residual from previous moments in history that has never gone away. And one of them is the power structure of feudalism. We still have a tiny amount of human beings who have an enormous amount of wealth and power. And it doesn't matter that the basis of power has gone from land to money, that this only liquidifies the basis of power, makes it a little bit more mobile, but the power structure remains. And I'll get to later, when we start discussing population issues, why that would be a bad thing. But we need to admit complexity, especially in human affairs, and we need to admit that the solution to this problem is likely to be multivalent, and that it is not going to be a market solution only, and that if a choice comes between continuing to make profits and rescuing the world from a giant natural catastrophes, that we actually have to do the rescue work and change the economic model. And so there are many alternatives that are coming into place here. If you Google post-capitalism, you actually get a really meager set of listings. They're very partial, they're small scale, they're often out of date, and they're talking about little local situations. Essentially, even though we know that feudalism became before capitalism, we never think about what comes after capitalism, and it's not being theorized. And this is another one of the weaknesses of economics, that it only describes a system of laws as if those laws are eternal, as if they're like gravity. But in fact, they're not like gravity at all. They're a system of laws that is always being changed, and so it would be nice to have a theory of where we were going to. And in that first 10 listings that come up on Google, when you put in post-capitalist economics, there is one really interesting book called Participatory Economics by Albert and Hahn. And one of the things that would be interesting about studying that a little bit further is that it would be very computer intensive. You would need almost a a gigantic information exchange to make that particular economic system work. And then if you are curious about my objections to capitalism, you could find a fuller description of them here in the books that I've cited. But the problem with theory is that really our problem is right now. And as the IPCC had said, we've got like 3 years left. And so a giant new economic system is not going to be enacted in that time. So you need to look at things that are happening in the world right now that might indicate ways that will help us to deal with this problem in the future, where the commons are accepted as being real and as being important and as having an economic value that can be costed out. So I would recommend looking at the town of Mondragon in Spain, which is run as a system of nested co-ops, including the banks and the credit unions, and Kerala, India, Cuba, Scandinavia, even France, simply because in France, it seems to me, at least up until recently, the idea that quality of life was more important than economic efficiency, and this is what makes it so shocking and insulting to certain Americans, that just stating that idea, that quality of human life is more important than economic efficiency, is an insult and needs to be slapped down instantaneously. We need to go back to that notion, because otherwise it seems to me that you've got economics backwards at its very basis. So maybe there should be Google economics. This is information technology. That's really what economics is. And so far, I say, although there are many interesting economic studies, the field as a whole doesn't have a good paradigm, doesn't have a forward-looking mechanism. It makes the mistake that in literature departments we call the pathetic fallacy. In literature, if you say that nature has intention and emotions, like Victorians might do in their poetry, then this is the pathetic fallacy. The fallacy that nature has pathos, it has emotions. Well, in economics, I think is doing the reverse. It's saying that the human world is like the laws of physics, or is unchangeable as the world of physics and can be described by mathematical models when it isn't really true. So maybe it's not the pathetic fallacy, maybe it's the ridiculous fallacy. But in any case, we don't have a good economic model. And it seems to me that not only could Google look into that and begin to study it as an information technology, but also could and already has, I think, begun to try it out a little bit in-house, one way or another. So if you were to do Google economics, if you were to try to do a fuller analysis of our current moment and what humans might do about it, you almost certainly would end up taking another look at the Paul Ehrlich's IPAT formula from the, I think from the 1980s. An argument over what was creating the most environmental impact, the first world or the third world, was finally, I think, resolved by admitting that it was a combination of what they called population times affluence times technology. Now, this is not an equation that works as a mathematical thing. You cannot plug in numbers in each one of these categories and then multiply them and get another number. This is a metaphorical equation. And if you double the population, it's not necessarily true that you will double in a mathematical sense the results that you get. Anytime you can replace the multiplying symbols with addition symbols and you still have a workable equation, that's when you know you've got a metaphorical equation. And that's what we have here. But it's a useful teaching device. And what it does is give you a way to talk about the various aspects of our current environmental crisis and break it down. The first one I want to talk about is technology. Because this is exactly where Google has made its initiative that it just announced a couple of weeks ago, the idea that they were going to invest $100 million in finding a renewable energy source that was cheaper than coal plants, which is a very worthy goal and a good first place to start looking as a company, particularly one like Google, given its capacities. And it's also good to have focused in on solar energy and not just photovoltaic, but on heat engines. That's a smart move because there's a lot of improvements that can be made there. And there's already a Southern California Edison plant being built that will have like a 500 megawatt plant, which is really a full-size power plant, that it will be made out of mirrors reflecting the sun's light onto a heating element that will then heat steam or move turbines in a different way. And so once again, it's very computer heavy. In that in the workings of the mirrors and the maximizing of the effect of the device. And then every one of the ones that I've mentioned here I think is known to everybody, and they all have the potential of a small savvy investment making a big difference in how much they will work in the real world and really quickly. So that I think that all of these methods should be looked into. And I only want to mention one, clean shipping. What does that mean? Well, once you get a series of giant shipping containers onto a ship and moving to a different continent, which is really happening all over the world, all over the oceans right now, and is a major polluter because of their giant diesel engines, it doesn't really matter if you have a perpetual flow going how long that ship takes to get from point A to point B, which means that they all could be sail ships. You could have very, very big ships with computer-controlled and modern materials. The crew sizes would be larger. It would be less economically efficient using the current rubric of what efficiency is. But on the other hand, it would be utterly clean power and wouldn't be adding any carbon whatsoever. You could make the crews co-ed. You could make them colleges. You could make them universities or party ships one way or another. You could make a life at sea quite interesting. It's not as if we have full employment right now. And so there's the possibility, I think, of making enormous savings there by simply changing the paradigm as to how we do our shipping. The other areas, I think, are obvious. And the only other one I want to talk about here is the angel investing. The idea that instead of just being venture capital, where always capital is being invested with the idea that it needs to make a profit and really fast, like within the next couple of years, this so-called angel investing, where people who have enough money that is discretionary somehow, that they can find the important technologies and bring them across the valley of death, the bridge between the beautiful research ideas that never actually get enacted in the real world. And if you look at the history of technology, you see the history of things like the diesel engine or the light bulb or the telephone, you realize that all of these could have remained in the lab, and that it is a tricky process to get from the innovative research idea to full-on production. And yet these are technologies that are actually intensely needed because we have to have renewable energy if we're going to continue going the way we are. I also just put at the bottom, I mean, so much of Google's work has been open source, which is something I would like to learn a whole lot more about. But what if these solar plants, what if there was a solar heat engine plant that was like village-sized? If the engineering was completely done, the costing out, the actual investment, maybe there would be bonds. Of course, the initial investment in a power plant is intense, but if after that you have got free, clean energy, on a renewable basis, it might be worth doing and spreading. And the advantages, the return to the company that invents this stuff would be manifold, and it might not come in immediate profit, but it would come. So as a science fiction writer, I have to address this issue because it's coming up all the time now. We're in such desperate straits. Should we get into geoengineering? And these are the obvious ones that I've heard about. Everybody has, I think. To me, the unintended consequences of the biological methods are really scary, particularly messing with the ocean. But on land, you know, it would be equally problematic if something got out of control. And we don't know what will happen. If you put iron in the ocean, yeah, you get more plankton. Yeah, they sink to the bottom of the sea or below the 100-meter limit, and then that's a lot of carbon disappeared. But what else happens? We don't know, and we already have, as I pointed out, a problematic enough situation in the ocean. The physical methods, I think, are safer. You know, you can shoot stuff up in space and see what happens, but they're outrageously expensive. And so it's hard for me to imagine that we will decide to do it. And also, as a culture, we are so bad at coming to consensus on big issues right now that the idea that we would deliberately mess with the Earth's climate, even though we've accidentally done so, as a byproduct, to deliberately do so with the idea that we're going to supposedly control the results, I think is pretty much an impossible goal right now. And so I would say let's not do the Google terraforming. Maybe that could be an emergency measure. Maybe in the 2060s, in this very room, somebody will be outlining all of the things that are possible to do that might reduce the temperature on Earth, and maybe they'll all be ankle deep in water at the time. It will be a very dramatic situation. But that's for another time. And meanwhile, I think all it does is leach energy away from the decarbonization project. People will be thinking, well, okay, maybe we don't get rid of the carbon, but we can always throw up 12 trillion little plastic balls into space, and they'll bounce out the sunlight away. We'll be saved in the end. And so let's not worry so much about the carbon burn. I think we need to worry about the carbon burn. And so I don't think it's the time to talk about geoengineering yet. Population, a very interesting book on this in terms of demographics. I have heard, how many people can the Earth support? These are carrying capacity estimates. I have read estimates ranging from 100 million to 12 trillion. And that is a 4 magnitude difference. So it's like you get scientists in a room and you say, well, how many tennis balls are on the floor? And one of them says, well, there's 100 tennis balls here on the floor. And the other one says, no, there's 100,000. Well, this is a big difference. And it seems to indicate there's a problem going on. And indeed, those two estimates, the 100 million estimate comes out of the deep ecology movement and seems to regard humanity as a kind of a parasite and be better off with less of us. And then the 12 trillion estimate comes from a physicist in Britain who seemed to translate the amount of insulation, solar energy hitting the Earth directly into human calories with no intermediate steps whatsoever. So those estimates can be thrown out as outliers. The strong estimates I've heard range from about 2 billion to about 30 billion. And this is satisfactory because it's within the same magnitude, but it still is a pretty big spread. If it's 2 billion, then we've already overshot by a long distance. If it's 30 billion, then we have a little bit of a comfort range. When you go to the UN demographics, which are maybe like the IPCC, maybe that's the best you can get, you get carrying capacity estimates of anywhere between, say, 6 and 15. And the demographers at the UN were predicting that we would have somewhere between 10 and 15 billion before it topped off. Now, that prediction is about 20 or 30 years old and has been revised downward. And it has happened because of the effects of women's rights on population's growth. Within one generation, in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and the prosperous half of Mexico, you have seen the reproduction rate go from about 7 children per mother to about 2. And this happened in one generation as a result of social changes. And so that's when you get to this point where social justice becomes a climate change technology, that we need population reduction. And you can't do it by way of population control, which is a phrase, a pair of words that will make most politicians and every human being shudder. It goes back to China's one-child policy and the idea of a big brother telling you how many kids you could have. Nobody likes it. Population reduction, however, is probably something that we need. Every year, the world's population goes up by about 75 million people, which is about the population of, say, the British Isles. And no matter how much progress you make in other areas, you get this increasing population that is burdening the whole system. So it seems to me there should be also Google demographics, because again, this is an information technology. It should be studied, I think, collated and talked about. How many people can live on this planet sustainably over the long haul in a steady state? And then talk about population reduction strategies as something that Google would get involved in defining, discussing, and maybe even promulgating or advocating. So that implies Google Washington, the idea of a lobbying firm. And here, really, it's diving into the swamp and mud wrestling in the most political process there is, making the law in Washington, D.C. That is a very technical martial art, jiu-jitsu kind of thing, where you need to be there, you need to know the rules of the game. Essentially, you need a kind of lobbying firm. And you can't just hire a top-notch lobbying firm already in Washington, D.C., because amongst the multitude of their clients, they will have competing loyalties. They will not want to insult Senator A on issue B by advocating their particular cause too hard. And so they won't, no matter how much you have paid them as an individual client. You need your own firm. it costs you about $1 million or $2 million to start one up, and then cost $1 million a year or so to run it thereafter. And so Google has just put $100 million into improving a technology that is already pretty damn good, this solar heat technology. So I think they could afford, you could afford to put in, say, $10 million or put in $50 million and it would be endowed forever. But you could also run it as a 10-year experiment because, as James Hansen said, the next 10 years are the crucial ones. So that going to Washington and getting into the mud and wrestling over each and every law, each and every clause, is real work that is climate control work. And so naturally, that kind of work also does suggest Google Ads, although that's another swamp that I hesitate to recommend to you. But it's another information technology. It has to be considered. Lastly, affluence, which at a conference I attended, somebody suggested you change affluence to appetite. Because after all, what does affluence consist of? It could be actually a very low resource burning life, and you could still, depending on your health, your emotional set, you could feel very affluent with a very small expense of both money and carbon. So appetite might be a better word for it. In any case, let's look at this, because we have a situation here in the United States that is a kind of carbon obesity crisis. And it is partly infrastructural, the way that we have built our freeways, the way that we've built our power systems with their path dependencies, so that even if we decided, okay, we're going to get back to 5% of the world's carbon burden, it would be tough to get there because of the infrastructural problems. But it's also a cultural set. It has to do with hyperconsumption. It has to do with the American culture that we live in of more things all the time, and the sense that we're all in a rat race of perpetual action, perpetually trying to keep up, to make enough money, to buy enough things, to have the life that everybody else around us is leading. Because we are very much social creatures. And if you're in a culture that's doing this kind of stuff, then you do this kind of stuff. It's hard to go against the grain. It's not really what we are designed to do evolutionarily. And so this has gotten me thinking about, well, how do you make culture change of the sort that looks like you're asking people to go backwards, tamp down, simplify, lower standards of living, et cetera, et cetera. These are all kind of bad-sounding things. How do you talk about this stuff? And I got interested in contemplating questions that come out of sociobiology. What are we as social creatures, and what would make us happy? And so you go to sociobiology with a certain trepidation, because when it was first introduced by E.O. Wilson in about 1970, it was immediately attacked as being a new kind of social Darwinism. We didn't want to hear the news from the other primates. The idea that nature was red in tooth and claw, and that the primates were a matter of alpha males wailing on everybody else, was all, the world was already depressing enough without the idea that this is just human nature and we could never escape it. So the response to sociobiology was at first quite political. And an immediate kind of allergic response, because social Darwinism, the idea that Darwinist evolutionary theory justified the oppression of the strong oppressing the weak, and that's just the way nature was already a lot of the worst incidences of the 20th century came out of that justification system. So the attack on sociobiology was quick. However, it has since been modified both by Wilson's own work and by the work of one of his students, Sarah Hrdy, who lives up in near Davis, near me, whose book, Mother Nature, is extremely instructive. She looked again at the primates, both with her own eyes and through the literature, and began to talk about a sort of feminist sociobiology, or the notion that the alpha male might have been like the president in a parliamentary system, really useful for flag-waving events and for ceremonial events, but that the prime minister that really got things done in the guts of the machine was the alpha female, and so on and so forth. Throughout the description of every single primate activity was being reevaluated by Sarah Hrdy in a way that was paradigm shifting, I think, and allows one to use sociobiology to just consider where we came from. And in evolutionary terms, it's rather mysterious, because in the million-year run-up to becoming human beings, the brain grew by a factor of 3 in about 1 million years, which in evolutionary terms is really, really fast. And yet, we were doing the same things throughout that period. In other words, the technology stayed the same. You can find Acheulean hand axes for a whole 500,000 years of pre-human history, the same kind of all-purpose Swiss Army knife tool, never changed, and the lifestyle never changed, and yet the brain was growing like a balloon being blown up. Well, to me, this is a kind of a paradox that needs exploring, and so you go to, what did we do during that million years? And it's pretty simple. This is what we did during that time. And every one of these activities in modern society has been replaced, I think, or augmented by technology, and often made for profit and become something that we consume rather than we do, or something that we watch rather than we do, and simulated one way or another, or augmented. And a lot of times, the augmentations are useful or exciting or interesting, but a lot of times they also add to the health crisis that we're in. We're not actually doing the thing that made us human. We're not actually doing the thing that would keep our body going. Some of these, in particular, say looking at fire, that is a powerful experience that we don't have very often anymore, and there's a big part of our brain ready to look at fire that hardly ever does look at fire. In fact, my friend Terry Bisson says that when people go to movie theaters, what they really want is to sit in the dark together and look at flickering in front of them. And that's the whole point of the movies, and that's why it doesn't matter whether the movie is good or bad. You still have had a good experience to go and do that. Maybe there should be a Google Fire, a website that you go to, and since especially fire burns so much carbon, you need a simulated one in this case, so that in the evenings when you're around, rather than watching TV and doing other things, you just have a fire going. Maybe it'll be better for health, maybe better for mental health. And many of these other activities here have they have a commercial replacement that makes them other than what they were to begin with. It's pretty obvious in certain cases that if you have a technologically augmented and have to pay for something like sex, then you don't have the same activity that you had before. And so we have come to what I call the technological sublime, a phrase out of postmodern criticism that never meant anything before, but I think it means something. The things that we do in ordinary modern life, our primate brains are freaked out by them. And we do them anyway, suppressing the terror and enjoying the beauty of it. And the sublime was a real experience. When you were in the Paleolithic and you were in the middle of a lightning storm, it was beautiful, it was terrifying, you were there, and it was amazing. The shaman takes you down on the cave on a special night when you've drunk certain drinks and had certain preparations, and you go down into the cave and suddenly there's animals on the ceiling overhead and they're moving and everything. A sublime experience, amazing. But those were supposed to be the exception to the rule, and then everyday life would have been this stuff, okay? But in the technological sublime, our ordinary life is in the sublime all the time, and then the daily activities that actually made us human are something that we do on a kind of a vacation basis. You actually pay money to go off on vacation and do these things, and it feels good. And why does it feel good? It's because that's what made us this way. So I bring up to you an old English phrase. It's like on page 10 of Bartlett's quotations. It's older than the written language itself. It's not really an American proverb right now. Enough is as good a feast. You don't really see that as the motto of very many companies, because it's not really very good for business. It's not really good for capitalist growth, which has to be 3 or 4% a year, or else the entire economy freaks out. And compound growth inside a finite system is one of the many problems that we're running into right now. So what I like to do, especially when I go to college campuses, is to say, it's not a matter of you lowering your standard of livings. It's not a matter of we torched the planet having our party, and now you have to suffer, put on your hair shirt, become as a monk or a nun, and get used to deprivation because, sorry, the party's over. This is not a good message. And the thing is, it's not even really true, because the hyperconsumption life of America, the 25% of natural resource burn at 5% of the world's population, has not made us happier, hasn't made us healthier, hasn't done anything but made us more frantic and wondering why, in a kind of a Chinese finger trap or one of these addiction problems, the more you do it, the less satisfied you get, even though it seems to be the goal, hyperconsumption. Stepping back and actually going back to these activities as often as possible. And these activities, many of them are free. And many of them can be done immediately right outside your door and take very little augmentation, although it's nice to have a good pair of running shoes.
So that you're not killed by animals.
Yeah, you don't want to be killed by animals, but if one chases you and you get away, you know, you've had a good moment. It's been sublime. And those are important. So what I'm saying is that I'm not making an anti-technology argument. You need good dental care. You need good anesthetics. But appropriate technology, a phrase out of the 70s that has almost gone away because we are so inappropriate. The idea that a technology is here to make life better, and that there could be a cleaner and more sophisticated tech that would include clean energy, that would allow us to do all the things that we love to do, but would also augment and allow us to actualize ourselves as primates with a certain set of basic biological habits that we have. So that last Google, I didn't know what to call it. Various possibilities, none of them actually adequate to the situation of trying to describe, without being negative, without being anti-technology, but talking about true appropriate technology, talking about true human actualization. How do we get forward to a sustainable civilization, which I call permaculture, because it sounds like both permanent and it sounds like permutation, because it'll always be changing. It'll just be something that can be sustained. You can help me with that, perhaps. But what could be done here? There's just a few things that I think immediately could be done on campus. You might as well have all these meetings outdoors. You've got one of the greatest climates on Earth. And, 300 days of the year, you could have meetings outdoors, and it would be nice for everybody concerned. Gardens, you need that garden. It's a beautiful thing to have, and it'd be really good for all of you to go out. When you get frustrated with writing code, you go out and kill some weeds. It is very gratifying. And good for you. The rest of them, I think, are a little bit more radical. I would like to suggest that the point of view that I'm recommending, the permaculture project, is an old American project. It comes out of many places, transcendentalists, the Quakers, the Shakers, and Henry David Thoreau, the greatest American writer, has written about this extensively, and his journal is too long. It's 2 million words long. So Google should be scanning it and maybe putting it on a page in real time. Every day when you wake up, you can see what Henry did that day. It's very instructive. I've been doing it myself for about 10 years now, and I'm only about 1/4 of the way through his journal. And I recommend it to everybody because it teaches you a lot about what it means to be an American. And also, it's not in the heroic mode of John Muir. You don't have to go off to the Sierras for 5 years straight and behave like a saint in the woods. That'd be great if you could. But what if you're a suburban, responsible parent with a job? Well, Thoreau is perfect for that because he was suburbanite through and through. Small town guy. His nature was just the kind of stuff you see in your backyard and in your garden, and yet it was a full life, a full natural life. And then because this is a California company and we're talking about a kind of a California culture, among other things, although I would think that there's global variants of it everywhere, but there's something beautiful about California culture, I proclaim as a Californian, and Muir as a really good saint figure for that. Well, Hetch Hetchy should be restored. That water can be cached downstream in the Don Pedro Reservoir, and you lose nothing but a tiny bit of hydroelectricity. And since you're a Bay Area venture that is probably drinking Hetch Hetchy water, or maybe that's just San Francisco, I don't know the details this far down the peninsula, but it would be really a powerful thing if Google were to be saying, let's give Hetch Hetchy back to the national park, let's restore it, let's learn about landscape restoration and do something that would make John Muir happy. And so I come to my end just in time. We're at an interesting point in history. We are at the emergency moment. Remember what the IPCC had said. The next 2 or 3 or 10 years tells the tale for how things happen afterwards. Now that's a strange moment, and one tends to doubt it. There is the principle of mediocrity out of physics, which is a bad name for a principle, but it's probably true that you should be skeptical of anything that makes you look extraordinary or unusual in history or in physics. And that's the principle of mediocrity. Well, is it really true that we are at a crux point in human history? Hard to tell. It kind of looks like it, though, when you look at the scientific evidence. And at the same time, you have the invention of the internet. And the internet was like a library without a card catalog until Google came along. So that Google is like the key of a very important story. And now, in the future, 1,000 years from now, when people write the history of the world, if it's a reasonably comprehensive history, Google is going to get mentioned. And if it's a history of technology, Google's going to get a chapter. So this is rare power. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of forces on this planet have a lot of wealth, they have a lot of fame. But daily presence and also a key to the information tech of the moment, these are unusual. This is what Google has that most companies don't have, and it doesn't last forever. You're only new and hot for a certain amount of time, and then, you know, Microsoft was new and hot once, IBM was new and hot once, Standard Oil was new and hot once upon a time. You only have a certain window of time, and it happens to be the same window of time that humanity is in big trouble. So when I recommend these various information techs, I know for one thing that Google is already doing a lot of these, and that I'm only saying things that you already know and have done. But on the other hand, I also would urge you, from the viewpoint of science and our grandchildren, and from the viewpoint of 1,000 years down the line, that it's time to actually go outside the box, or business as usual is not good enough anymore. That we are in a moment where business as usual doesn't hack it. Don't be evil doesn't hack it. You have to go from the negative, which as a writing instructor, I always hate things written in the negative, to the positive, which is not actually be good, because be good is not as a kind of a wimpy message. It's more like do good, or that's not grammatical, so you get to do some good. Do some good. Well, okay, that's the moment that we're at. You got to do some good. And I like it because in my Mars novels, the company that was doing some good was called Praxis, and Praxis is an old lefty term for do some good. So it all comes together. Don't be evil, praxis, they're by a transitive equation, they're basically almost the same thing. So Google is already there and is a kind of a science fiction thing happening right now. And since everything right now is a kind of a science fiction incident, it's fitting, and this is its moment. So let's see what happens with this moment. And thank you. Very nice. Yes.
So, do you really think there is any hope?
Yeah.
Do you really think there is any hope? One of my favorite James Blish novels, I can't remember the name of it now, read him a long time ago, had a population escaping a world whose sun was about to explode, and the last contact they got from the planet was of a war going on between the poles because it was heating up. Isn't that more likely than
well,
possibly bad outcome?
there's an old European phrase, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I am an optimist by will. I say that it's not, we don't have the luxury of being pessimistic anymore, that is a disservice to our kids. So when I say, of course we have hope, this is a matter of policy. When I look at the scientists who are beginning to freak out and say it's already too late, I think, well, that's scary, because I'm not a scientist, can't make the same kind of assessment with a full sense of having an ability to judge it. But I would say that what they need to do is the same thing. They need to say, it's not a question of is it too late, because here's the thing. If you ask is it too late and you say, no, it's not too late, then you think, oh, good, I don't have to do anything. And you say, is it too late? You say, yes, it's too late. And you think, oh, good, I don't have to do anything. So it's not the good question. What you want to say is, how much can we save? And then that becomes a relative thing. Life on Earth will not end. This particular crisis will not end. The seagulls, the ants, the grasses, you know, there are life forms that are just amazingly tough. Cockroaches.
Corporations.
Yeah, corporations. No, corporations.
That's the problem. Corporations don't fear climate change. Why should they?
Well, they should. They have careers and lifetimes just like any other entity. They might be longer than human lifetimes, but you know, you don't see Standard Oil around anymore in the same way that it was before. And corporations, but this goes back to the economic question. Why shouldn't corporations fear it? If you put the real cost on carbon, it's like $50 a ton beyond what's charged. It's like $35 a barrel beyond what's charged. So corporations, especially the carbon dealing corporations, are dumping. And not only that, but it's predatory dumping. They're selling it for more than it costs to make. Well, who are they predating when they do this predatory dumping? Our grandchildren. Well, you know, anybody can make a profit if you rip off your grandkids. It's simple as pie. You just, you steal from the future, you pay the present, you say that was a profit, and then it's the future that has to pay the cost. But that's what we're doing systemically. So we could, as a society, we could say, well, let's make things cost what they really cost. And at that point, you are talking about taxes. Oh my God, taxes. Well, there should be a carbon tax. And at that point, if the whole society says, yeah, there's carbon taxes, then corporations, some of them will react and say, thank God, we can finally figure out how to deal with this in a rational basis. We're not dealing in a vacuum anymore, and we know what's going to happen. So I think corporations can be brought into the fold of the total human project, I guess is what I'm saying there. I like the backdrop, by the way, but
I'm a physicist by training, so let's say we reach a stage where the panacea exists, a nuclear fusion reactor, let's say, but the building of it is well beyond our technological, I mean, we have reached a stage of evolution in society where we no longer can throw the technological resources to build these in large enough scale to do it, you know, be it a fusion reactor or a shield blocking the sun or so. Have you thought about that?
that's a good science fiction story. And that is the mechanism by which one thinks of science fiction stories. Where does technology and society reach hard points or contradictory moments? And when people think about that one, which I myself haven't to any great degree, but it fits into the class of windows of opportunity. That history may have windows of opportunity that come and then they go. But the exploration of Mars is one that I'm very, very familiar with because of my Mars novels. The idea that, okay, we've got about 50 years where we could get it together to go to Mars, and after that it might not be possible. But what I'd like to suggest is that what we would need then is go stepwise towards it, and maybe even sort of sideways, and create a permaculture that gets into a balance, a sustainable balance with the Earth as its natural bio-infrastructure, and that once you get that balance back, you might have only a population of 3 billion humans. If they all are healthy and have food, water, shelter, clothing, education, a sufficiency, then at that point, it's going to be a stable population because the natural replacement rate of about 2.2 for human beings is achieved in all prosperous countries. Because no couple can bear to have more than a couple of kids without going crazy, more or less, unless you're really into it and like it. But the natural replacement rate would be achieved, and at that point, then you could then you could build, you could get out into the solar system, you could build the fission or fusion plant, and so we might have some recovery work to do, some carrying capacity work to do. And I hope that we can do that. What people fear, I think, is the general systems crash or the science fiction scenario of the fall, that civilization goes back to a barbarism because people began to fight for resources so intently that they began to destroy each other and the ability to do these positive things. And I still think that that's very, very unlikely, that we simply aren't that stupid, and that we have a moment in history that's mostly democratic. And that once 51% of the population comes to agree to this, that we need to do these things, then they will get done. So this is a somewhat optimism of the will because we are such a conflicted society right now. But I think there's also real reasons. This is another Google question, you know, and it's another information tech question. Is this just an imaginary relationship to a real situation, and the real situation we're totally screwed? Or is it an assessment of the real situation that says we still have the opportunity to reach a balance? I mean, I have inclinations, but I don't know.
You talked a bit about a different economics, and you've also written about it in your novels. Do you see any steps toward a different economics happening anywhere?
Yes, I do. First, and they're both quite legal. One of them is cooperatives, that people get together and the employees are basically privately own their company. There are not stock where outsiders are taking away the surplus value as profit, but actually it goes to the employees. And every 5 years or so, the employees review their management, decide management's doing a good job, rehire the management, and in the 5 years, the management definitely sets the rules and says, this is how we're going to do it, but then they get reviewed, somewhat of a reversal to the normal course of things. And co-ops are legal, and they're not widespread, but to me, it's a miracle that they're not, because they're obvious and they're a good idea. And then the other thing would be something you guys know much more about than I do, which is open source, which is the idea that open source shouldn't just be about computer code, but should involve other aspects of society. Engineering, all expertise could be open source. And what is that? That's the commons. There was a working economies where the commons was something that everybody went out and used, and it replenished itself, and then nobody owned it, and it didn't make a profit for anybody, but was the commons. And the attack on government that we see ever since the Reagan Revolution is an attack on the commons, because the government is the virtual reproduction of the commons. It's one of the few places that is all of us gathering together a whole bunch of capital, saying we're going to do this, we're going to do that. The government is the current manifestation of the commons. Open source is another kind of mind-boggling manifestation of the commons, especially to me because I'm kind of being newly educated to what it really means. As a computer illiterate person, open source is somewhat mysterious. But the better you explain open source, the more it might be taken as an economic model for other activities. Once you have a sufficiency, enough is as good as a feast, even better than a feast, because a feast makes you sick. Once you've got enough, then you begin to get into the gift economy. You begin to give out. You think, gosh, I've got what I need. It's like Maslow's levels of actualization, where once you get needs, then you go into desires and get into more spiritual things. And certainly the gift economy is part of this notion of return. Like, life gives me food and all these gifts, my friends, etc. Therefore, I give back. And this is not profit. This is not profit-loss thinking. This is non-capitalist thinking. And so we live in a capitalist economy, but it's also a democracy. It also still has a commons that is embattled by privatization, and yet it's pretty robust because people like it better. You can make a profit and still not feel good, but giving almost always feels good. So these are the things that I see. And I do think what they need is theorization. What they need is narratives, like science fiction novels, or describing how it could be and how it could feel. But it also needs theory. It needs economists who believe in it. It needs more people like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz. I mean, there are mainstream economists who are writing about this stuff right now. But even they, I mean, when you name two out of an entire field, what you would say is, we need a lot more of this. Why, when I Google post-capitalism, or alternative economic models, why don't I get 5 fat textbooks that are being taught in every business school and every economics program? I mean, why don't I get those? Because the blinkers on our ideology say, as Margaret Thatcher once so famously said, there is no alternative. But that's stupid, really. There are alternatives, and there always were. It's just as crazy as saying there's no such thing as society, which she also said. And that's like saying there's no such thing as an abstract noun. It's one of those, I never tell a lie type statements, or this statement is a lie. A paradox, and basically wrong. So Google, if you've got $100 million to put into hardware, then maybe there's $100 million to put into software. And certainly you guys, more than almost anyone on earth, know that software is a technology and is as important as the hardware, right? I mean, this is more or less the name of your game. And so I hope that new economic models and alternatives and the next step, and also reform, how do you get from this massively entrenched set of laws, in which capitalism is kind of, not only has it bought up almost everything on earth, but it's bought up the next 30 years in the forms of contracts, debts, mortgages. And supposedly those are all written in stone and can never be changed. We see right now with mortgages that isn't quite true. But the idea that the future is already bought and is already secured by somebody who then gets to dictate what happens is a powerful notion that people want you to believe. But it isn't really true. I mean, tomorrow, or maybe I should say a year from now, there could be an election in which we elected a group of people that decided that everything was going to change in the next 5 years. It happened in 1932, for instance, and it could happen again. So new and better economic models, I hope, will come out of that process too, because we need them bad. It's part of the project. You can't get out of climate change without a better economic models. Well, thanks again, folks. It's been fun.